Hello and welcome to our weekly look inside Syria. I'm Veronica Pedrosa. The civil war in Syria is showing no signs of easing and fighting remains as fierce as ever. Neither the opposition nor the government strong enough to end the conflict, a conflict that has gone on for more than 2 years and killed at least 100,000 people. Our focus in this week's programme is the situation of religious minorities in Syria. The uprising in Syria began with peaceful mass protests for diversity and democracy during the so-called Arab Spring of 2011. But it turned into a civil war with sectarian overtones and minorities caught in the middle of the brutality. Syria is a multi-ethnic and religious nation, and these ethnic and religious groups will need to bridge the deep divisions between them to prevent even greater sectarian violence if the government of President Bashar al-Assad falls. Here's an overview for you. Sunni Arabs make up 64% of Syria's population, while Sunni Kurds make up 10%. Alawites, a part of Shia Islam to which the Assad family belongs, represent roughly 13% of Syria's 22 million people. 10% of the population is Christian, and 3% is Druze. But these figures have likely shifted given the huge exodus of refugees into neighbouring countries and, importantly, given the rising number of foreign fighters coming in. Well, to discuss the religious climate in Syria and what the future holds for religious minorities, we're joined by our three guests. In Istanbul, Anas Al-Abda, a member of the Syrian National Coalition. In London, Mark Latimer, Executive Director of Minority Rights Group International. And also in London, Haitham Sebbiha, a Syrian political activist. Welcome to you all. I want to start our discussion by looking at the question of what the real threats are to religious minorities. Can I ask you to start with your view, Anas Al-Abda?
I think the biggest threat to minorities in Syria and in general in any country in the world is dictatorship and tyranny. Simply because it destroys the social, political and economical ties and relationships that connects the components of society together. We've seen this in many other countries, and Syria is not an exception. As a matter of fact, during the rule of Hafiz al-Assad and Bashar al-Assad, we saw the biggest immigration of the Christians, the Syrian Christians, outside Syria. So it is dictatorship and tyranny that drives these minorities into a desperate situation, even though the Syrian regime always gives the false perception that it protects minorities. But when we look into the numbers, we see very clearly that that is not the case, especially if we talk about religious minorities.
All right, let's refer to Mark Latimer in London, because your group, Mark Latimer, has recently undertaken a study of what's going on in Syria, saying that Christians are under, they could be looking at an existential threat in Syria.
Yes, that's right. The situation with regard to not just Christians but also other religious minorities in Syria today is absolutely critical. I would agree with the former speaker to say that the al-Assad regime is no friend of minorities. I mean, both Bashar al-Assad and his father were responsible for very serious violations of the rights of minorities.
But there is a narrative that says that they were in fact friendly to minorities, coming from a minority themselves.
That's true. I mean, obviously there's an Alawi base to the government in Syria. But I think this attempt by both sides to try and say that they're a friend of the minorities and the other are an enemy is a gross simplification. What we've actually seen over the course of the conflict is a growing sectarianisation of the conflict, with minorities at risk from both the government side and from the rebel side, and also a process of intimidation, threats, sometimes inducements to try and get particular communities on the side of any group that holds ground in question. But I think it's important to say, and I think there's a tendency to see this conflict very much in religious terms now, that at its base it's not a religious conflict. At its base it was a popular uprising against an oppressive regime, but both because of this internal process where you see communities defensively coming together to try and to save themselves, but also because of the deliberate actions both of the Syrian government and of other players in the conflict to make it sectarian, you've seen a much greater threat to religious minorities.
Well, actually, the Assad administration would say that this is, in fact, a war against terrorism. Haitham Sabahi, what's your view? Is this a religious war or what?
No, this is not a religious war. I mean, this is now it's taking some shape because of the involvement of the what we know Al-Qaeda affiliated group like Al-Sham and Levant group, Al-Nusra Front and the others, which they carry out what you call it massacres against some sectors of Syria. But let me say something here. I mean, in the last 40 years, let me say, or 50 years since Al-Ba'ath Party came to Syria and the late President Hafiz Assad and Bashar Assad themselves, Syria never promoted either minority or a majority. They believe in Syria with the Ba'ath Party, what you call it, slogans, is Arabism and nationalism. We never, I mean, we don't have this sort of issues. This sort of issues arise, as you said in the beginning, it was a peaceful demonstration. But we don't forget on the 21st of March, the first person got killed is Nidal Janoud, and he was a truck driver
that under the
carrying
Assad
vegetables.
administration, there was really very strict controls on freedom of expression. I mean, you were punished if you spoke about identity issues.
No, because we, as Syrians, we lived like this for years. We never believed we never talked who is a Christian, who is a Shia, who is an Alawite. We weigh the person, or we respect the person, or we don't, according to that, how this person behave, let me say. Well, not because this is an Alawite or this is a Christian. I have friends from all different sectors.
All right, Anas that is correct. There was a peaceful coexistence until the war broke out. What happened? Why did it disintegrate so quickly?
Well, let me first of all say that the tolerant and coexistence values in the Syrian society has been instilled in the cultural identity of the Syrian society for thousands of years, before Bashar al-Assad and before Hafiz al-Assad, and it will continue in the future as well. This is nothing to do with a specific political regime. However, one has to say that during Hafiz al-Assad and Bashar al-Assad, we saw the biggest immigration of the Syrian Christians outside Syria. This is proved by numbers and also by the number of refugees. The fact is that we had a dictatorship that was promoting only loyalty to the regime, nothing else. So if you are loyal to the regime, it doesn't matter what background you come from. But this regime has also focused and depended primarily on minorities to strengthen itself. And we see that from the structure of the army and other institutions as well. So
in which the leadership tends to be Alawite.
Yes, absolutely. And this is something that the regime has to use in order to stay in power. And because of that, it tries to show this or to give this perception that it is friendly to the minorities. But in actual fact, it was promoting a dictatorship regime that is driven only by loyalty, nothing else.
It is such chaos on the ground in Syria that I find it very difficult to be able to make a kind of decent comparison between what is going on the ground now and what it was like under the Assad administration. Can you make that kind of comparison, Mark Latimer?
Well, I think one thing that you need to look at is what were the causes of minority oppression under the Assad regime before the start of the uprising, and what are the dangers now. And there is a big distinction. But before the start of the uprising, I've already said that Assad was no friend of minorities, but the principal danger was because of the promulgation of this Ba'athist nationalist ideology, which saw certain minorities as a threat if they seemed to be any kind or present any kind of alternative to that Arab nationalist trend. So, for example, probably the group which came under most attack were the Kurds in the north. I mean, many Kurds were deprived of citizenship. There were systematic human rights violations against the Kurds in the north. There were also, again, some Christian groups, like Syrian Christians, once again mainly in the north of the country, whereas other Christians were courted, and that kind of sort of divide and rule tactic, which we also saw in Iraq under Saddam, it was very part and parcel of how the Syrian government operated. Now we're saying those primarily nationalist, ethnic issues becoming more and more turned into religious or sectarian ones. As communities have broken apart, and as I say, other actors, including from the Gulf
right.
or Iran, have become heavily involved in the conflict.
Indeed, just the other day, the Al-Qaeda leader Zawahiri was reported to have issued new orders to fighters in Syria to, quote, avoid killing Christians and Shia. This would seem to go against what you were saying a bit earlier, Haitham Sabahi, that these Islamist groups were going out for particular minorities.
Yeah, of course, the Islamist group and Al-Qaeda, this is their agenda. I mean, they fight or they control for their own ideology. Otherwise, anybody who doesn't believe in their ideology or has differences with it has to be killed, or his head is being cut. Mr. Al-Abda, I mean, he was talking about complete fabrication. There's no Christians left of Syria. Syria is the home for the Orthodox, as all the churches of the Orthodox know. There is a Catholic, there's the Maronite who comes into Syria. We never had the differences. I mean, only when it comes to the ideology of a Muslim Brotherhood, who's Mr. Al-Abda from, and the other takfiris, what we call the fundamentalists, like Al-Qaeda, or the medium like, what you call it, Islam brigades. This is the people who is carrying out. We saw this 2 months ago, and all the media was talking about it yesterday, how a number of these groups, 20 different factions, from Muslim Brotherhood to Al-Qaeda, to different ones, to a Free Syrian Army, attacked 10 villages in suburb of Latakia, and they killed people there, and they killed about 200 to 300 and kidnapped others.
Anas, did you want to respond to this?
I am a Sunni person. Let me say something. Let me say something here. I am a Sunni person, and there is in the government of Syria, there is all sectors. We never looked at this. Our foreign minister is Sunni, our deputy minister is Sunni, the other deputy minister is Sunni, the defense minister is a Christian. We don't look at these issues. These issues came with all these fundamentalists arriving to Syria and saying only or lying about Syria targeting the Sunnis.
Right.
There is 1 million Sunni in Latakia refugees. There is 3 million Sunnis in Aleppo being surrounded by this group, deprived from food, deprived from electricity, and deprived of things. That's why the Syrian army headed to Aleppo now to liberate these people.
Sorry, let me bring Anas Al-Abda in now. Can you respond to that?
Yeah, first of all, I'm not a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. I've never subscribed to their ideology, so this in itself casts a shadow of a doubt over what Haitham Sabahi said, not only about me, but the rest of the issue as well. It is very clear that since the beginning of this revolution, it was the Syrian people were very focused on two things: freedom and dignity, because they lived in 50 years of dictatorship and tyranny. They were only interested in achieving freedom and dignity because they didn't have such that in the last 50 years. The regime responded with military might and transitioned the revolution from a peaceful one. Even Bashar al-Assad accepted that the first 6 months were peaceful. And it's because of the regime's security services tactics, the revolution transition into a military one. And since March 2011, the Syrian regime killed more than 100,000 people. It was the first regime in history to use Scud missiles against population area, and recently chemical weapons. And I don't know such a regime can, using all sorts of conventional and non-conventional weapons, whether they can claim anything regarding minorities.
Okay, Mr. Abda, let's pause for a moment, because I want to concentrate on a report that was issued this week, because on Friday, Human Rights Watch issued a report making new allegations of atrocities. The rights group accuses rebel fighters in Latakia of killing almost 200 civilians in August. It says at least 5 rebel groups with links to Al-Qaeda are responsible for planning, funding and carrying out those attacks in Latakia on August the 4th. Human Rights Watch says the killings amount to war crimes. It reported that 43 of those killed were women, children and the elderly. And it's calling on the UN Security Council to refer the situation in Syria to the International Criminal Court so that the people responsible on both sides can be held to account. Human Rights Watch believes the rebels who kill the civilians are linked to Al-Qaeda, as I've mentioned. Gentlemen, this seems to be the first well-documented incident of the Islamist groups attacking a group of Alawites. What is your response to this report, Mr. Abda?
Well, first of all, as you know, in war, the first victim is truth. The report, which was sanctioned by HRW, Human Rights Watch, was under the supervision of the Syrian regime, and it was also censored by the Syrian regime. This is according to Reuters, by the way. So we need to establish the truth because we don't have 100% of it at the moment regarding what happened there. But if HRW report was correct, then we said very clearly within the Syrian National Coalition that we condemn any targeting of civilians from any background. And this was our policy from day one, from the beginning of the revolution. And we condemned that the same way we condemned the Syrian regime in its targeting of Syrian civilians. And let me also make one point very clear, that the main organization accused in this report, it's the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant, is an organization that's supported by the Syrian regime.
But there is also reference in the report to the FSA's Operation to Liberate the Coast, isn't there?
Well, all the organizations that was named in the report are not part of the Free Syrian Army. This has to be, highlighted. The Free Syrian Army was not involved in these crimes, if it's proven. It's these crimes, if it's proven, being perpetrated by Al-Qaeda affiliated groups, which are not only against the regime, but also against us.
I can see that Haitham Sabahi wants to interrupt at this point. Go ahead, Mr. Sabahi.
Mr. Abda say what's happened in the suburb of Latakia has nothing to do with the Free Syrian Army. We saw all on all televisions Salim Idris arriving to the suburb area and saying it started what you call it a special operation to liberate Latakia. Salim Idris was just standing there. I mean, Salim Idris is the chief of the Free Syrian Army, and he was on that spot, and everyone saw those videos of I mean, the interviews on all television and all Al Jazeera also. What we're saying here, the sectarism is used by this group.
Yes, go ahead, Mr. Abda.
Let me respond to that. Free Syrian Army is fighting the regime in every corner of Syria. In every inch of Syria, we are fighting the Syrian regime. In Latakia, in Damascus, in the north, south, east, and west. However, the HRW
we're talking about particular
Al-Qaeda affiliated groups.
Okay.
And that is the operation that the report was talking about, nothing else.
All right, gentlemen, let me just let Mark Latimer get a word in edgewise at this point, because given the basis of your research previously in Syria that we saw in your report on minority groups there, how does the HRW report square with what your own findings?
Well, the HRW report is likely to be highly accurate. I mean, I think they were collecting evidence in some very difficult circumstances. But you know, you slightly suggested in your commentary that this was the first major atrocity carried out by rebel forces, and unfortunately that's not the case. We've seen a whole list, a whole succession of gross abuses of human rights by rebel forces in Syria, including on many occasions by the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham, but not just by them, by other groups as well. That there was a well-known video of 7 Syrian soldiers who were extrajudicially executed by a particular rebel commander, another extreme rebel commander, who was widely quoted as saying, our mission is to eliminate Alawis. So I think these Syrian, these sort of sectarian currents are there in both the rebels and, of course, on behalf of government forces. But what I think, you know, I think there's a real danger, and we saw it just now in the dialogue between the other 2 guests, of the use of atrocities as a way of sledging the opposition, as a way of discrediting the opposition. But at the same time, I think it's important to say that most of those killed in Syria, that, you know, over 98% of those killed in Syria are civilians. And effectively both sides are operating by killing civilians who they see as in some way culpable or erroneously or as in some way strategically placed to aid the other side. And that is the problem. And it is in that situation that minorities who are typically already facing prejudice in society, who have less protection or support from their own militias, are particularly vulnerable. And we've got to be very careful when we see any side using the extreme abuses of the other side as a way of justifying their own actions.
Listen, we only have 3 minutes left, so I need to ask for brief answers to my next and final question to all 3 of you gentlemen. If I can start with Mr. Abda, the issue that I want to look at very quickly is the extent to which the religious hatred that is being stirred up at the moment prevents the political settlement that will inevitably end this war.
Well, I'm not that pessimistic, to be honest. I am optimistic that the true identity of the Syrian people have 3 main values instilled in them. First, tolerance. Second, you know, coexistence, and third, recognition of each other and respect for each other. And I think what guarantees a future, you know, coexistence in Syria is a proper constitution and a civil state that will guarantee the rights of all its citizens, regardless of their background, whether it's sectarian, ethnic, or political affiliation. And I think this is what we are aspiring
Mark
for,
Latimer,
and this is what we are dreaming about.
What have you noticed?
I think it's quite clear what the doomsday scenario is. I mean, it could get worse from here. Just across the border in Iraq, we've seen 10 years of sectarian violence, and that could continue in Syria. Clearly, what we need in any peace agreement is very firm guarantees for the protection of all minority groups, and a vision for the country which is inclusive and ensures that both religious and ethnic minorities are protected and have sufficient autonomy also to enable them to feel safe and secure.
And finally, Haitham Sabahi.
Well, I believe all the Syrians are protected on the side of the government by their government and by their army. I mean, this element, or the Takfirist group, or Levant and what you call it, Iraq group, or the other fundamentalists, I mean, there is a fight against terrorism in Syria, and that's what we have to understand. We, as Syrians, in Damascus, there is all different minorities and majorities. In Latakia, in all the cities, they're all the same. They live together side by side. These new elements arriving into Syria from Chechnya, from Libya, from Iraq, from Taliban, from different groups, the Syrian army has no choice to fight these people, because the Syrians at the end, they know how to live together, and they know how to worship freely. Nobody control this, how every sector worship. The Syrian government or the Syrian authority made out of different sectors, the army made out of different sectors. And let me say to Mr. Abdo one thing, when every person of 18%, when he joined the army, nobody asked him if he's a Sunni or he's an Alawite or this. Everyone served in that army is called the Syrian Arab Army, and everyone goes to university, and everyone goes to school, and everyone join the government if they want, or they leave the country. And this is how we're going to leave. Those takfiris, they've been pushed on us. We're going to fight them to ever, or they have to leave the border.
That's all the time we have for now. Thanks to all my guests in London, Mark Latimer, in Istanbul, Anas Al-Abdah, and also in London, Haitham Sabahi. And that's it for today. Thank you for joining us. Remember, Al Jazeera has extensive and continuing coverage of what's happening in Syria, not just on this program, but with our hourly news programs, and of course online at aljazeera.com. And if you're on Twitter, you can find me on @vpedrosa. Thanks for watching Inside Syria. Goodbye for now.